Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I had the opportunity this summer with my kids to go all the way up to the northern part of Scotland. We stayed in Inverness, which was awesome. And we also went up to Orkney, which is off the coast of northern Scotland. And one of the things that you learn a lot about when you go into Orkney is the Viking presence that was there. And we got to go into some incredible places that even predate the Viking presence there, but including some of the places where we got to see some Viking runes. It was graffiti. And they were reading it to us. And I wish I could have made a video, but we were inside of a tomb and we weren't allowed to film. But they were reading some of the graffiti, and it was basically these guys like talking about how tall the one guy was and how the one guy, loved animals. And it was really, really fascinating. And I'm going to Ireland in 2 weeks, and I know there was a strong Viking presence there as well. And I've been to York, where there was a strong Viking presence. In fact, the name York comes from the Norse word for the town, which is Jorvik. So I want to talk a little bit about some Viking history, because I really want to start getting into that history, because the Viking history infects everything. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it as a descriptive term, because these were people that went to North America and Africa and Asia. They were in Russia and France and the Byzantine Empire. And of course, they had a strong presence in what is today the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. So I think it's an important part of history to talk about, because these are people who really were explorers and conquerors and went so many incredible places. They were the forerunners of the Normans. They were the Northmen, the Norsemen. That's where Normandy gets its name. That's incredible history here. And of course, there's a couple of great TV shows that cover these time periods. That all is to say, a way of introducing today's video, which is 5 most legendary Vikings and their true stories. It's from the channel Unknown5. We've done a few of their videos before. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. And I want to thank Jackson in Lake Tapps, Washington. I've never heard of Lake Tapps. I don't know what part of Washington that's in, but thank you, Jackson, for your support on Patreon. Signed up about a week ago. I'm grateful to all of our supporters. Let's dive into this one.
For hundreds of years, the sight of a Viking longship on the horizon would strike terror into the hearts of those in its path, and simply living by the coast became a risky lifestyle due to the ever-present danger of Viking raiders descending on your home to take everything you own, along with your very life.
So the funny thing is, obviously living on the coast is where it's the most dangerous, because they tended to raid on the coast, but think about how often they not only raided the coast, they stayed and they went inland, and they ended up in places like Paris, which is nowhere near any coast. So while that's absolutely true, it didn't mean you were safe if you were further inland.
Yet while Vikings are often depicted as bloodthirsty, violent pirates, they were also skilled warriors, craftsmen and explorers who were the first Europeans to discover large parts of the world, which had until then been unexplored. The blending of myth and fact which surrounds the Viking era has created legendary characters whose exploits terrified their victims, but left a lasting legacy which has shaped the modern world.
And I think it's important when we understand, and again, this is not a topic I'm really deep into yet, but I'm trying to learn, when we understand that just as the Roman world and later mainland Europe was heavily shaped by Christianity, and that dictated so much of what happened in the history of the last 2,000 years in Europe. Their belief, for example, in things like Valhalla, in this real strict kind of warrior code that these Vikings had. And understand that when we say Vikings, we're not talking about a specific group of people. We're talking about a number of different Norse peoples who were raiding and exploring and doing these things. So they're very eclectic in terms of their background and their beliefs and their motivations. But, if you believe very strongly in the idea of Valhalla and this idea that being a warrior is about the greatest thing you can possibly do, that's going to dictate a lot of how you live your life, just as it was for Christians.
Here are my choices for 5 of the most legendary Vikings and the true stories behind them. Number 5. Harald Hardrada. Getting his first taste of battle at just 15 years of age, the young Harald Sigurdsson was unlikely to have had any idea of the life of war, conquest, and adventure that lay ahead of him. A life which would see him participate in battles across much of the known world, fighting in the service of the mighty Byzantine emperors, winning the Norwegian throne, before ending his life invading the Kingdom of England.
That's pretty cool. I didn't really know a lot of his backstory. I mean, most of what I know about Harald Hardrada centers around what happened in 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, him losing to Harold Godwinson, who then turns around and loses to William the Conqueror. But thinking about the fact that he was down there fighting for the Byzantine emperors, that's crazy.
His incredible actions and ruthlessness in power earning him the name Harold the Hard Ruler. He found himself in a vicious fight for his life when in 1030 AD, aged just 15, he went to war in support of his half-brother, who was attempting to reclaim the Norwegian throne. The attempt failed miserably, and Harold was badly wounded in the defeat, his half-brother killed in action. Broken and humiliated, he was forced into exile and fled to Kievan Rus, where he served in the army of the Grand Prince.
And Kievan Rus was another place that had heavy Viking influence and presence.
A hunger for wealth and power would eventually draw him to the legendary imperial city of Constantinople, where he served in the Byzantine Emperor's elite Varangian Guard, which was a prestigious bodyguard unit made up of Viking warriors.
And this is why I was saying that they kind of infected everything, and I don't mean that as a negative term. I'm just trying to give a descriptive term of how the Vikings were everywhere, and they were in everything. It's crazy.
He fought with distinction and rose to become the commander of the Guard, and is thought to have seen action all over the Mediterranean and Middle East, even becoming entangled in imperial succession disputes and intrigue. Yet his work for the emperors had made him incredibly rich, wealth which he had wisely been sending back to friends in Kievan Rus for safekeeping.
So this is brilliant. This shows you, I mean, we do a disservice when we think of Vikings as these kind of berserker strong warriors that are idiots and just fighting all the time. I mean, no, these are brilliant guys. These are educated people. These are people who understood how to run government and use their wealth. And you see that evidence here from how he is exiled, but he puts it to good use. And he's always thinking about, what do I need to do to go back home?
Perhaps in the hope that one day the time might be right to return to his homeland. The opportunity finally presented itself in 1046, after the Norwegian throne had passed to his dead half-brother's illegitimate son, Magnus the Good. Using the massive fortune he had accumulated to fund his bid for the crown, Harold returned home. However, perhaps intimidated by his uncle's reputation, Magnus agreed to share power with Harold until he conveniently died just a year later, leaving Harold as the sole ruler of Norway.
I'm curious to know how he conveniently died. This seems to happen a lot.
Yet one crown was not enough for Harold, and he spent the next 15 years attempting to seize the Danish throne, his constant warring and tendency to mercilessly crush any dissent at home, earning him his new title Harald Hardrada, meaning Harold the Hard Ruler. Despite successes in battle, by 1064 victory had eluded him, and he gave up his claims on the Danish throne. However, just 2 years later he would once again be at war.
So, can't get the Danish throne, what's the next best thing? Well, you got a lot of Danish presence in the eastern half of England. You know, we called that the Dane Law because it was very heavily ruled over and influenced by the Vikings. And so, go take that.
In January of 1066, the King of England died childless, leading to a succession crisis as several powerful men claimed the throne. Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England shortly after. However, his own brother Tostig, along with Duke William of Normandy and King Harold Hardrada, all maintained their own claims and raised armies to win the throne through war.
It's such a fascinating time period, and it's such a transformative time period in the history of Britain that you have 1066. We talk about the Norman conquest, but it could have very easily gone a different way, because Harold Godwinson, who takes the throne in 1066 at the beginning of the year, is dealing with two separate invasions, and he goes north to deal with Stamford Bridge when he probably should have faced William the Conqueror first, but William was having trouble getting across the English Channel. So imagine for a minute If conditions had been more favorable, William comes across the English Channel and Harold Godwinson defeats him, which very likely could have happened anyway at Hastings. Hastings is a battle that could have gone either way. Imagine he defeats him and then comes north and Harold Hardrada wins at Stamford Bridge. Totally different future for England.
Tostig Godwinson, brother of the newly chosen English king Harold Godwinson, decided to pledge his allegiance to Harold Hardrada, and so the two joined forces. Harold invaded northern England in September, yet despite scoring some early victories, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by Harold Godwinson's army, but in the process perhaps weakened the King of England just enough that he too would later perish in the famous Battle of Hastings.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, as close run as Hastings was anyway, if he hadn't had to fight Stamford Bridge first, who knows what happens.
The hands of William the Conqueror, allowing William to seize the English throne and changing the course of history forever. Harold Hardrada is said to have died a stereotypically Viking death in the thick of battle, charging forward in a berserk rage, wildly hacking at the foes who surrounded him until he was struck by an arrow to the throat, thus bringing to end not only an extraordinary life, but the life of the man generally considered to be the last great Viking leader.
It's amazing how many of these guys, despite being on the ground fighting in hand-to-hand combat, die from arrow wounds. Harold Godwinson believed to have died the same way.
Feat marking the end of the age of the Vikings, a warrior culture which had terrorized so much of Europe for so long. Number 4, Rollo. Of the countless
Speaking of William the Conqueror,
thousands of Viking warriors who raided European shores, just a handful are remembered by name today, and even fewer left behind a lasting legacy. Yet Rollo would rise from being just another Viking raider to forging a powerful duchy and establishing a dynasty which would see his descendants become kings. His blood still running through the veins of many of the European monarchs to this day.
I would argue his blood probably, almost certainly runs through the veins of every British monarch, or every European monarch, and a good bit of the European population, myself included. I mean, we're talking like, at this point, how many generations back? We're talking 40 generations probably to get back to that point. But yeah, I'm a descendant of Rollo, and probably most of people with Western European descent are.
Little is known about the man's origins, and it's assumed that he was a minor noble in his native land, being born in either Denmark or Norway. In the sagas he is given the byname the Walker, most probably due to his immense size, which made finding a horse strong enough to carry him a difficult task, resulting in him being forced to travel on foot, yet his imposing size and fierce presence in battle would help him earn the respect of his men and the dread of his enemies. After a mysterious early life, Rollo left Scandinavia to participate in raids on England, Scotland and France, hungry to amass riches and power, yet it was the wealthy city of Paris that would become the focus of his attention.
Remember what I said, it's not just about the coast. I mean, you're going inland to Paris, and he doesn't get to keep Paris, but it works out pretty well for him in the end.
In 1885, he participated in the Viking siege of Paris, sailing up the River Seine, with a force that contained hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men.
Look at that, that's like a swarm. And yeah, you have that island there in the city, and they called that their region, I think, Ile-de-France. And I mean, that was your stronghold when in Paris, was that island in the middle of the Seine River.
After surrounding the city, tribute was demanded from the trapped Franks. However, despite being massively outnumbered, the Franks refused. The Vikings launched a furious series of attacks on the city that lasted for days. However, despite siege engines being used, the mighty walls of Paris held. Perhaps frustrated by the lack of progress, many of the Vikings abandoned the main force and decided to head further upriver, searching for easier prey. However, Rollo stayed behind with his men to continue the siege for several months more, until he was finally forced to retreat when the Frankish king Charles the Fat arrived with his imperial army. Yet, after having a taste of the riches France had to offer, Rollo refused to leave and would continue raiding French settlements and towns. The new Frankish king, Charles the Simple, encountered Rollo during another siege. However, despite his name, perhaps he was wise enough to recognize the future threat to his lands that these Northmen presented.
So, think about it. You're in a situation where you are trying to rule over a kingdom. This is, in the aftermath of Charlemagne, and you're trying to figure out what to do. and you've got this annoying problem of Viking raids, and not just raids, but sieges, and they're going to hit you one place, and when they can't be successful there, they're just going to go somewhere else, and they're just going to keep appearing. What do you do about that? And often what these people would do would be pay them off, and then they would go away for a few years or a few decades, and then the next guy would come along and do the same thing. So how do you keep that from happening? Well, you give them a place of their own.
Despite defeating Rollo in battle, he was impressed by his leadership as well as the ferocity of the warriors he led, and so decided that Rollo might make for a valuable ally instead of a bitter enemy.
Instead of having a constant pain in the side, a constant, harassment, a constant source of losing men and money, give him some land, maybe some land that you don't really care that much about anyway. Make him an ally.
The king offered Rollo a great swathe of land to the north of Paris in exchange for ending his raids, swearing fealty to him, and protecting his kingdom against the future Viking raids from his people that were sure to come.
Pretty
Rollo
smart.
agreed, and his duchy was given the name Normandy.
And it's still part of your kingdom. He's a vassal, so now he's going to run it for you. And he's going to be an ally who's a good warrior. I mean, there's really not a lot of downside to this if you're the king of the Franks.
Being Northman's land. The two men's agreement was sealed by Rollo agreeing to be baptized a Christian.
There you go.
And taking the king's daughter as his wife, despite her being perhaps as young as 5 years old at the time. Rollo would prove to be a successful
They didn't consummate the marriage when she was 5.
ruler, cementing control over his new lands and laying the foundations for the Duchy of Normandy to become one of France's most powerful regions.
Now, it's important to note, because a lot of people like to point out, William the Conqueror was a Viking. No, not really. You got to remember, by the time, in the intervening time between Rollo and when his descendant William the Conqueror is Duke of Normandy and invades England, there have been multiple generations of people who have lived in this place and that have intermarried with French people. So William the Conqueror, despite his direct paternal line being of Viking ancestry, he is both genetically and culturally very French.
His descendants and subjects would become known as the Normans, a people with a formidable reputation who would eventually conquer much of southern Italy and even parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Yet perhaps his most famous relative would be his great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, who would lead a successful invasion of England in 1066 and become king after victory at the Battle of Hastings. It would be through William that Rollo would become a distant ancestor of virtually all modern European monarchies today, as well as many of the claimants to thrones which have long since been abolished. Rollo finally died in 930 AD, and despite having been baptized a Christian, he is said to have died a pagan, with one historian claiming that as he sensed his death was close, he went mad and beheaded 100 Christian prisoners in a final defiant act committed to honor the Viking gods.
Just covering his tracks.
Number 3. Eric the Red. Most explorers risk their lives.
This is probably the Viking that we learned the most about in American schools growing up, is Eric the Red, or Leif Erikson.
Voyaging into the unknown on the promise of obtaining fame and fortune, lured by the thrill of discovering uncharted lands and seeing what no other man has seen before. Yet Eric the Red did not have such lofty ambitions, and was instead left with no other choice but to sail west to the icy and unexplored wilderness of Greenland, as his tendency for murdering those who he had disagreements with led to his presence no longer being tolerated in more civilized society.
I can't imagine why.
Killing as a method of conflict resolution seems to have been in his blood. Aged just 10, Eric and his family were banished from their native Norway after, according to the sagas, his father committed what is vaguely described as a number of killings, and they were forced to start a new life in northwestern Iceland. Yet it would not be long until Eric followed in his father's footsteps. While working on the land, a group of Eric's slaves accidentally triggered a landslide on his neighbour's farm, which destroyed the man's house. Enraged at the damage, the neighbour slaughtered the slaves responsible for the damage, yet it seems as though Eric took offence to the man killing people who were deemed to be his property. He retaliated by attacking his neighbour, killing him along with another member of the clan. Yet rather than risk a blood feud, or perhaps doubting their ability to take the ferocious man down in combat, the kinsman of the dead neighbour took the legal route, demanding that he instead be banished. Eric was forced to flee to a nearby island,
On a cruise ship.
leaving some sacred beams of wood he had inherited from his father in the care of a friend. However, when he later returned to collect the prized items, his friend refused to hand them over.
I feel like this is not a guy that you want to say no to. I mean, there's a reason why he left, and it's because he's got a bit of a temper when it comes to people who he perceives as having wronged him. And the way they're describing him as quite a powerful warrior, maybe not the guy to mess with.
Eric decided to take them back by force, and in the resulting fight killed the man's 2 sons, along with several other men. Once again, Eric had been involved in bloodshed, and in 982 AD, the local assembly exiled him from Iceland for a period of 3 years.
Oh,
he was now an
that's
outlaw
not bad.
in both his native Norway
You killed a bunch of people? Alright, just leave for like 3 years.
and his adopted home of Iceland. There seemed to be no place left for him in the civilized world, and so he decided to sail to the mysterious and unexplored lands to the west, which other Norse before him had sailed to, but none.
It's interesting to think that there are all sorts of different reasons why people embark on exploration. And sometimes they're not because they just want to be great explorers and they're curious. Sometimes it's because they have nowhere else to go.
None had dared settle. He spent his 3-year exile charting the coast of Greenland and scouting the ice-covered landmass for suitable locations for farming and hunting, before finally finding an area in the southwest that seemed relatively ice-free.
It's pretty much where all the people live now.
With his exile over, he returned to Iceland with the intention of gathering more men and ships to establish the first permanent settlement, yet he knew he would need to attract as many people as possible to make the venture a success, and so he conjured up stories of a place called Greenland, which seemed far more appealing than the ice-laden reality. Yet
The time that a country, is it independent? No, I think they're still part of Denmark, aren't they? Was named as an act of propaganda. I love that story.
this act of marketing worked, luring hundreds of people to follow him across the sea in 986 AD. Eric the Red ended his days as chieftain of a colony, which would eventually grow to hold 5,000 people. Yet a history of murder and the foundation of Greenland's first Norse settlement were not his only legacy. His son Leif Erikson would go on to become widely viewed as the first European to explore North America
And this is the naming system that was in place for these Norse countries, was that you would be named after your father's first name. So Leif Erikson was Eric's son, and if he had a sister, she would have been Eric's daughter.
500 years before Columbus embarked on his famous voyage to the New World. Number 2, Ragnar Lothbrok.
Ragnar. If you've seen Vikings, you know his story.
Tales associated with the legendary Norse hero Ragnar Lothbrok vary from being the son of kings, raider of powerful Christian kingdoms, husband to famous shield maidens, looter of Paris, father of famous Viking warlords such as Ivar the Boneless, and even the descendant of Odin, the Norse god of war.
And this is what's tricky about some of these stories, is that the nature of how they were written down as these kind of epic sagas makes it difficult to discern what is fact and what is fiction. You know, what's the real story at the heart of this? Who's the real person? And how much of this was embellished for the sake of making a really good story that would inspire your people? It can be difficult to kind of separate fact from fiction.
Yet are the accounts of Ragnar based upon the exploits of a real man, an amalgamation of several different warriors? Or
It's just like Robin Hood or King Arthur. I was about to say Alfred. There's probably a real person in there somewhere, but the stories over the years get more and more embellished.
just a made-up myth designed to inspire? According to legend, Ragnar was born the son of Sigurd Ring, who was the king of both Sweden and Denmark, and obtained the byname Lothbrok, which means hairy breeches, due to the animal skin trousers he supposedly wore.
And it's spelled Lodbrog, but it gets pronounced Lothbrok.
Although he is said to have claimed descent from Odin, stories of a ferocious Viking warrior wreaking havoc across 9th century Europe are widespread amongst several different sources, and his name is most closely linked with a series of merciless raids against France and England,
Especially
which would have
England.
made him a wealthy and powerful man. He favoured attacking lightly guarded monasteries, which provided easy but rich pickings, as well as targeting Christians while they were occupied with religious celebrations.
Yeah, I mean, because you got monasteries, number one, there's a lot of wealth there. There's a lot of expensive cloth or gold, and, just from the art, the things associated with worship. But they're also generally going to be pacifists, so you're not going to have a lot of warriors to fight against. It's an easy target.
Yet he also proved himself to be a formidable warrior and leader, attacking and defeating powerful armies and well-fortified towns, with perhaps his most legendary deed being the capture of Paris in 845. With a fleet of longships, he sailed up the River Seine, looting and plundering as he went, before finally reaching the fabled city of Paris, in the beating heart of France.
Did a little better than Rollo did on that one.
French King Charles the Bald, grandson of the mighty Charlemagne, was defeated by Ragnar and Paris fell, with the humiliated king forced to hand over an eye-watering £7,000 of silver to Ragnar in exchange for leaving. Yet, despite amassing such
And see, they came back. He paid $7,000 to him, and then Rollo comes back, a little bit later on. So that's why you give him land.
Unbelievable levels of wealth, Ragnar's raids against European shorelines continued, earning him powerful enemies. Eventually his luck would run out, and after being shipwrecked on the English coast during a storm, he was captured in Northumbria by King Aelle and executed in a manner which sealed his legendary status.
Snakes.
Furious at the raids Ragnar had carried out in his lands, King Aelle dreamt up the most painful and humiliating death he could think of, punishing the upstart Viking by having him thrown into a pit of vipers, the fall breaking his bones, and leaving him to be slowly bitten and poisoned to death by the vicious snakes.
And this is the same King Aelle who's said to have been executed using the blood eagle a little while later.
According to the Icelandic legends, Ragnar faced death with pride, pleased that he would soon be entering the gates of Valhalla, before issuing a final prophetic warning of the fate that awaited King Aelle and England when the news of his death reached his sons. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered, confidently predicting the bloody vengeance his sons would visit upon Aelle and the kingdoms of England. It's through his sons that Ragnar's legacy would continue, fathering many men who became famous warriors in their own right, including Bjorn Ironside, who would explore and raid the Mediterranean, and the feared Ivar the Boneless, who along with his brothers would lead the great heathen army across the North Sea to avenge Ragnar, conquering large sections of England. And
look at how much of English territory is in the Danelaw. I mean, you're talking all the way from right about where Birmingham is today, which is right up here, kind of in between Leicester and Lichfield, all the way down to London, and all the way over East Anglia, all of this.
Establishing the Danelaw, a portion of northern England that was governed by the laws of the Danes, and would
all
be
the way up pretty much to modern-day Scotland.
By large numbers of Vikings. Whether Ragnar was a real man, a merging of multiple characters, or simply a myth, his name still echoes through the ages, having become a hero amongst his own people, but a devil amongst those whose suffering he caused.
I think he's definitely, there's somebody there. Whether all the stories are true, it's based on somebody.
Number 1. Ivar the Boneless.
His son.
An intriguing mixture of mystery and incredible brutality makes Ivar the Boneless perhaps the most famous Viking of all time, with the man himself becoming legendary for his cunning and cruelty. His conquests would spread fear, terror and destruction across the British Isles as he executed a bloody plan of revenge that would see entire swathes of the country fall under his control, countless thousands perish in battle, and even great kings mercilessly put to incredibly savage deaths at his hands.
And this is one of the reasons why you're going to eventually see a united England, because when the Vikings are doing all this raiding, you've still got multiple kingdoms. You've got Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex, and you've got Kent and others. And eventually you're going to have a guy like Alfred the Great who's coming along and who is not necessarily a powerful warrior, but is very intelligent and a shrewd politician. And he's going to dream of a united England that can stand up to this. And eventually it's through his grandson that you're going to have England united for the first time.
There are several theories regarding how Ivar obtained his famous nickname, with the most popular being that he suffered from some form of bone disease that made him prone to breaks and fractures, leaving him unable to walk. However, the name could have been given to him because of his flexibility in combat, or simply because he was impotent. There have even been theories that the name could have...
Had not thought about that possibility for why he was called the Boneless. I always just assumed it was some kind of disease that he had a lot of broken bones, they didn't heal right, so it left him with, a lot of difficulty in getting around.
Been a mistranslation from Ivar the Despicable to Boneless, as the two words in Latin are very similar.
That's a great point, because you have like Ethelred the Unready, who it was not the way it sounded. It just means he was badly counseled. The words mean different things.
Yet, if he did suffer from some kind of disability, it did not prevent him from becoming an intimidating warrior who inspired the army under his command to achieve great victories. In 865, Ivar and his brothers assembled what became known as the Great Heathen Army, an unprecedented gathering of Viking warriors from all over Scandinavia, which possibly numbered in the tens of thousands.
Obviously, they didn't call themselves that. We're the Great Heathen Army. That was the name given to them by the English.
According to legend, the army was put together to exact revenge on the English king of Northumbria, who supposedly executed Ivar's father, the famous Ragnar Lothbrok, by having him thrown into a pit of snakes. However, whether or not this is true is unknown.
Well, they're going to get Ayala back.
At this time, Northumbria was embroiled in a civil war, a conflict which Ivar and the Norse would have been well aware of, and so it's possible that the invasion of England was carried out to simply take advantage of this weakness. Yet the sheer size and...
I should say, this happens to me sometimes. I say something and then the video goes on and I'm still thinking about the last thing I said. I understand that the pronunciations is more like Ayla, probably, because it's that weird A-E thing that the Anglo-Saxons had. That's where you get a lot of the names, like Edgar and Edgar the Atheling. It's a very common thing. When you see those names with like that AE, you know that that's probably an Anglo-Saxon name.
And scale of the invasion does suggest that it was motivated by personal reasons rather than just a desire for land and wealth. Regardless of its intention, the most destructive and violent invasion of England had begun. Ivar's army quickly captured the Northumbrian capital of York, defeated the English army, and captured King Aelle, the man who was responsible for his father's death.
If you go to York today, and I highly recommend it if you're ever in England, fantastic city. It's a big city, but it's also kind of got a small town feel to it. And amazing history. You've got Roman history, you've got English history, you've got Viking history, all in one place.
For such a crime against his family, only the most gruesome and painful revenge would do, and Ivar is thought to have had Aelle killed using the Blood Eagle, a terrifying Viking method of execution which involved cutting the victim's back open, breaking the rib bones one by one with an axe, before pulling out the lungs to form a gory wing-like shape draped across the back. Some sources even suggest that at this point the victim might still be alive and would be forced to endure the unbelievable agony of having salt rubbed into the giant open wound before,
if they hadn't passed out from shock by that point,
they finally died. Whether or not this is true remains debated, but what is known is that Ivar carved a bloody path across England, displaying not only a genius-like understanding of battle tactics and strategy, but also a disturbingly brutal streak in the treatment of his enemies, perhaps using such excessive cruelty as an extension of his battle strategy, the fear accompanying his name often forcing potential enemies to surrender without a fight. In one such example of this excessive level of violence, after taking the kingdom of East Anglia, the former King Edmund was beaten with clubs, tied to a tree, and shot full of arrows, before being beheaded and having his lifeless head thrown unceremoniously into a nearby ditch, all because he refused to become a vassal and renounce his faith.
And this is as much about the message you're sending to future opponents as it is punishment for this particular guy. You want this to get out. You do something horrible like this so people think twice about opposing you.
The conquests and raids carried out by Ivar continued all over England, Ireland and Scotland, where monasteries and towns were destroyed, civilians slaughtered, and settlements pillaged on an unbelievable scale. with the vast amounts of plunder and slaves taken making their way back to Ivar's base of operations in Dublin, making him extraordinarily rich in the process.
Yeah, people forget that he was launching most of these raids not from Sweden or Norway or Denmark. He was launching them from Ireland, which is also heavily Viking.
The circumstances of Ivar's death are disputed, but it's thought that he lived to a surprisingly old age before finally succumbing to a non-violent death, unlike the thousands of unfortunate people who died horribly as a result of his invasion. The people of the British Isles breathing a collective sigh of relief as Ivar the Boneless finally passed from this world. So those are my...
All right, that was really interesting, and I definitely learned some things I didn't already know. I hope you did too. And if there are particular stories or videos related to Viking history that you'd like me to take a deeper look at, please let me know in the comment section below. Just keep in mind, if you do post a link, it won't show up right away. It'll go into a filtered system, and I'll have to go in to approve it. It's a thing that YouTube does to prevent spam and people posting porn links and stuff like that. So I want to thank Doug in Thornton, Colorado, and Emerson in Phoenix, Arizona for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much for everything that you do for this channel. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.